My name's Robbie Luckett. I'm professor of history and director of the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State University. Today is September 22nd, 2021. It's approximately 10:34 a.m. Central Time. I am joined by Dr. Deborah Mack. Dr. Mack, will you, for the purposes of our sake, state your name and spell it for the record?
My name is Deborah Lynn Mack. That's D-E-B-O-R-A-H, middle name L-Y-N-N, last name M-A-C-K.
Do I have your permission to record this interview?
You do have my permission.
Dr. Mack, can we begin with some background information on you? Where you're from, where you were born, how you grew up, what your family was like, your educational background, those kinds of things.
Sure. I was born in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, in 1952. Chicago was still then formally, legally segregated. So I was born into an all-Black community. I also, when I was an infant, I'm the eldest of 5. And my parents, within a couple of years, had moved from an older conventional house that had been changed into apartments to some of the first public housing. In fact, it was the first high-rise public housing in Chicago. And we moved in there. And when I was 7, we moved from there to Hyde Park near the University of Chicago. So I grew up, although we moved into a technically integrated community, and that was supposed to be a progressive community. In reality, I realized we had no friends, associates, et cetera, in that community because we were one of the few Black families and we were small children. I'm the eldest of 5, so we played among ourselves. And my really social life, besides a lot of family, was with the all-Black Catholic school that we went to. Largely. So we maintained, although we moved out of a segregated neighborhood, our social world actually was still with that historically segregated neighborhood and other Black neighborhoods throughout Chicago where relatives lived.
So you were educated in a Catholic school?
Yes, I'm a fully recovered Catholic. Yes, my father's people are from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. My mother's people are from Lexington, Mississippi, and we still have family land, et cetera, there. But my father's mother wanted my father to go to a very a college prep, at that time, all white boys Catholic high school, and he had to be baptized Catholic in order to go there. The rules, of course, back then were if you were Catholic, you could not marry a non-Catholic. So my mother was baptized Catholic in order to marry my father. And they both actually met in college. They both went to Roosevelt University, which was a World War II established university that was considered progressive, and it was integrated. It was a public integrated university. They were both music majors. But when you were Catholic, you had to promise that you would raise your children Catholic. So we were all baptized in Catholic and went to Catholic church. I'm talking old school Latin. And I attended a Catholic grade school and an all-girls Catholic college prep high school, Aquinas Dominican. And then I went to the University of Chicago. I chose the University of Chicago because I was interested in anthropology. And at that time, I was interested in programs that were Stanford, University of Michigan, and Chicago, because I scored really highly on the standardized tests. I got buckets. We had cardboard cartons of application, acceptances. U of C actually sent an invitation to come spend a weekend there to invite, they invited some of the high scoring students. I was one of them, and they said, if you come, you're automatically accepted. So technically I never applied for college. I think about it now. I decided, this is cool. And I like the anthro program. So that's where I went. But after college, while I was in college, I worked for a museum, actually quite accidentally, for 3.5 years of my 4 years in university at the University of Chicago. There was the Oriental Institute Museum, which established in 1902 and did the ancient Near East, was across the street from my dorm. I was fascinated by it. I ended up being a work study student For 4 years, I worked for the museum store. I baked clay tablets. I did photography. I cataloged an archive of a recently deceased archaeologist. Did all kinds of things. I was a docent and gave tours. I was a trained docent and gave tours. And I worked there for all through college. And in my junior year, had an opportunity to go to Egypt for the winter break with a young archaeologist, actually a young Egyptologist. Actually, she was the first woman Egyptologist in the United States, Jan Johnson, but she was very young, like 24 at the time. And so I was able to go to Egypt for 3 weeks up and down the country, hosted by grad students, faculty, et cetera, from UFC, and was very interested in that area. I came back, applied for and received a Ralph Bunche Fellowship, and spent a year as a research assistant at the American University in Cairo. Because they ran out of student housing after I got there, I was placed in an apartment with a graduate student, and I'd had about 4 weeks of face-to-face Arabic instruction. Because I was living in an apartment, I had to learn to do everything, and that's how I learned my Arabic. So I've been speaking Arabic since I was about 19, and ended up going to grad school at Northwestern University's African Studies program, because I was interested in doing work in Sudan, which was the sort of bridge between Africa and Middle East. Had Fulbright's Social Science Research Center, other funding to do 2 full years of field work, which was actually about how social change happens. I was interested in the history of civil rights, how the perception of the sort of, what would you call it? I was interested in the perception that there's, of course, automatic advancement over time in terms of social change, social justice issues. And there was a lot of theory about how that happens, when that happens, because there were many opportunities for these things to happen in the United States, like Reconstruction, that did not stick. And I was interested in looking at parallels of that. That work was, and so I was in Sudan for 2 years, came back. I got married near the very end of that. I met my husband actually while I was doing my field work, married near the end of that field work. I came back. It took me several years to finish my dissertation because I had two kids during that time, was writing like crazy, working part-time. He's actually my ex-husband, although we're all like family. So we were married for 10 years. We've been divorced for 30, which has been great. But we're all very close. So I was able to continue with my Arabic because I married into an Egyptian family, and we still see each other all the time. I'll be going to Egypt this next summer to see actually some of his sisters who I haven't seen in 30 years, although the next 2 generations behind us are here in the States and I see them all the time. But that work on how civil rights litigation, the history of what happened and did not happen in the US, I was looking at parallels because of theory. There were theories around really the politics of that, the economics of that, et cetera. That was the sort of trigger for me in connecting that work. I was finishing my dissertation when I was approached by Lake Forest College, that to ask me to come on faculty there. And I wasn't quite finished writing yet. They courted me seriously. And so that was my first teaching job for 2 years. But during that time, the Field Museum had begun developing a new exhibit on Africa. And I'm an Africanist by training. I never had an African-American history or anything class. But they approached me and asked me to sit in on some of the early audience research they were doing, community meetings, et cetera. And I sat in on those, gave them my observations. And the 3rd or 4th time I was asked to come in to meet with Mike Spock, who was leading this, Michael Spock. He asked me if I would co-lead the development of that exhibition. because I was an Africanist by training, et cetera. I said, you've read the wrong resume. I'm the legal anthropologist. He said, yeah, but your dissertation was centered around voice, representation, change. And I want this exhibition project, which was 25,000 square feet, to be informed by this. And I said, I've never done exhibits. He said, you can learn. And I found it to be far more, with all due respect to academe, I found it far more interesting because of the different types of, it's very audience-centered work. It's very accessible. You could be 5 years old, you can be 105, and there are different types of entry points. I was very interested, because my work, at the time that I was doing this work, Eyes on the Prize, for instance, was being developed. And at that time, I was one of the, I think, 5 Chicago area faculty asked to look at the previews of it, to pilot the teaching of the book that came along with it, because there were early concerns that Eyes on the Prize might cause, quote unquote, riots at the time. And so I was involved with these kinds of things in many ways, the public humanities. And within 2 years, I had firmly established that I had not gone through my life experience and all of this work to teach privileged kids it was not a good fit for me. And once I became involved in the work in the museum, which I also found really gratifying because there were different learning styles acknowledged. I worked with designers, I worked with mount makers, I worked with artists, I worked with filmmakers, I worked with 3D designers, I worked with educators. I mean, I found it really gratifying and a good fit. So when that project ended, when I left it finished, and we actually had to do 2 more editions of it. I decided I would not go back to university teaching. I would stay within the museum field. And that's how I transitioned into museum work full time. I mean, yeah, permanently.
So you worked on the exhibit at the Field Museum, and you left Lake Forest College at that point?
Oh God, I mean, yes, let's see. I actually was teaching at Lake Forest College from 86 to 88. I really didn't care for it. And I was teaching at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, really like freelancing while I figured I left after 2 years at Lake Forest College. It was just too elitist. Given what I was teaching, and I was also one of the very first, I was the only Black faculty member. So I suddenly become head of the African Students Committee, the African American Students Committee, the International Students Committee, the Women So-and-so Committee, you name it, you're the one on focus for everything. And I just found it very, I did not like it. I simply did not like it. I was doing some freelance teaching for a year and some other consulting that was sort of academically related. During that time, because of my dissertation, this is 1989, so South Africa was going through transition at the end of apartheid, writing a new constitution. Eritrea was going through transition to become independent from Ethiopia, and both constitutional working groups reached out to me and asked to use my dissertation because it was chronicling a lot of the issues. So I was doing some work of that sort, but I was teaching at the School of the Art Institute and began doing a little consulting work for the Field Museum and joined them full time in 1990. And actually my first task was, besides learning the ropes, was to write a National Endowment for the Humanities implementation grant proposal for the exhibition, which I had never done before either. We requested $1 million, which was huge back then. They had never given anything that large. We received 900,000, and then we received 100,000 from the Illinois Humanities. So we got that, but that was, then receiving $1 million from the MacArthur Foundation, and having a colleague grant writer who I still work with, I'm working with right now, who received $1 million from the National Science Foundation. This was in 1990, that exhibit cost $4 million. I thought it would be up for 10 years. It's still up as we speak. And there are plans to do some updating, et cetera. But it was the first exhibition that dealt with contemporary Africa in ways that were very collaborative. The opening exhibition highlights a family that we actually interviewed, and then they sat through the development of the storyline, reviewed every image, every word, everything. It was a reflection of them, and just even the design, the issue of voice, the issue of self-representation, because the pre-existing halls had been up since the 40s. You can only imagine what they looked like. But because it was considered a groundbreaking approach, we as team members were pulled quite a lot to talk to other museums, or museums came to us. The National Museum of the American Indian came to talk to our team, not the Native American halls. So this began to happen, which I thought was just public service. So of course you always do this for free, as you would in an academic sense. And then there was a big change in administration, and I was asked to come to help start up the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. And so I pulled my 2 kids along with me. It had never occurred to me to leave Chicago. Well, actually, I was at Northwestern University to develop an exhibition for their African Study 50th anniversary program for 2 years. Then I moved into Cincinnati. I left that project after 2 years. We started with 3 of us, I think. John Fleming came on as director 6 months after I arrived, but I led the architecture planning, I led the exhibit development, I led the design work. I recruited staff, and there were about 25 people when I left, and I only left because of corporate interference. Yeah. I just decided one day, as you know, there was a meeting, and I felt it was really inappropriate, and I quit. And I began that same, I quit, but it took 3 months for me to transition out. It also required them to hire 3 people to fill what I'd been doing, which was a learning lesson. But during that time, I was involved with development of an exhibit for the Children's Museum in Boston called Boston Black. And we were having an advisor meeting. And at the end of 2 days, the director, Joanne Rizzi, who's now at the Science Museum of Minnesota, said, I just wish we could get more of your time. We really could, I realize it's difficult. I just wish we had more of your time. And I said, well, actually in 60 days, I'm going to be leaving. She said, great. Can we sign you up? I began consulting in 2000, and until 2012, I worked from home. I probably worked with 40 different museums. What began with exhibits with the Park Service, with African Burial Ground, Tuskegee Airmen's Field, et cetera. But I worked with a lot of small museums. I worked on non-African American exhibits, interpretation, master planning. You grow these skill sets. That's what happens. You say, but I don't do this. And they go, but we need you. Like board development. That was when I began doing a lot of board work with a lot of African American museums that were small to mid-size. They were either coming on board, they were expanding or redirecting, they were updating their protocols and practices. They were looking for they were just bringing on the next generation of professionals. I probably worked with 40 different museums during that period, all of it while I was based at home in Savannah, Georgia. Yes. I moved to Savannah after my kids left home. It was like, yes. So you end up doing a lot of work with teams, and so you get a lot of exposure. That was what was different than, and I think in my background, than many of my colleagues who move into a curatorial role in a single institution. And there are different ways of curatorship, but a lot of it is rather academic and conventional within a single institution. I ended up having to do that, but other kinds of work across many institutions. And so it really broadened my view as to various models of practice. This is in part because when I started my work at Field Museum, it was under an exhibit developer model and not a curatorial model. So while we were content experts, we also had people who specialized in interpreting or translating one kind of learning into multiple kinds of learning because most people do not learn by reading or writing. That's the majority of people. And if you want to have greater accessibility and greater impact, you are placed, as Paul Martin always said, you meet your visitors where they are and you take them to the next level. That has always strongly influenced my work. I mean, it's a baseline for my work, whether it's board work, professional training work, and the sort of the concept that you plan with and not for in museum work is very fundamental to me in everything I do. I was working from home. I was consulting from home when I was asked to, I'd done some committee work, review work, advisory work for Smithsonian, just various things. I was served on Smithsonian Council. I was an advisor to several exhibits that were developed in different museums. But then Claudine Brown, who set the stage for the planning of the African American Museum, asked me to develop one of 3 collections reports. And one was on art, one was a history report, and one was on the availability of what they just called material culture, the everyday. I basically worked with 7, 8 colleagues around the country to compile that, to really develop and identify and then compile that report. And that was part of the federal submission, which there are all of these federal requirements and documentation. That was part of the submission to approve the moving forward with the museum. And it was compiled as part of a report that was called The Time Has Come. That was the official title of it. So that big report becomes a large appendix to the smaller, executive summary per se. But I was also then asked to serve on the search committee for a director for the museum. And I don't remember who the other participants were, but I was the only woman. And I recognized that the Smithsonian leadership at the time was very conservative, shall we say. There were a couple of women who were very strong candidates, and I understood early on they would never be considered. There was a first round of candidates that came forward. They were vetoed. I vetoed all of them. 5 candidates. And as we discussed the qualifications that were needed and put together a pool for a second round, I just remember describing the kinds of considerations and experience and complexity that we needed in someone, because it was very easy to recruit someone as a director who would literally roll over when instructed to do so by Smithsonian, which did not have a good history in this kind of work. I was also very aware of the 20 years of pushback and resistance to the concept of this museum being funded, but managed by Smithsonian, because Smithsonian had never demonstrated any competence in this area, shall we say. And so I remember that second conversation, and I said, we need someone who can do A and B and C and brings X and Y and Z. We need someone like Lonnie Bunch. And I remember someone said, well, do you know Lonnie? And I said, well, we're not friends exactly, but I know him as a professional. And they asked me to reach out to him. And so Lonnie and I had some conversations. I remember his initial reticence because he was in Chicago, and his wife, Maria, a museum educator, and his daughters loved where they were. And he had to really consult with them. But they felt then ultimately it was a good idea. And Lonnie came in the second round of interviews, and frankly, he stood head and shoulders above all the other candidates. It was unanimous. And when he came on board, I was asked early on to be part of the Scholarly Advisory Committee. So quarterly for 7 years, we came on site for meetings, but in between I was advising on collecting. I pointed out collections that I knew of. I was an interface for collections. We reviewed storylines, master planning issues, especially around audience research. I felt that they had a really strong approach to the museum. And then Lonnie asked me to come on board as staff, and I said, oh, thank you, no. That's really, it's flattering, but no, 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 no. I really loved working from home. I loved the autonomy, the flexibility. I loved the range of things I was doing. I loved the independence. I really did. He asked me again a second time a few months later, and I was very gratified and flattered, and I shared that with him, but I also declined again. I just said I just didn't see it. I didn't see being locked into another institutional box. The third time he asked me, he said, before you say no, just hear me out. And he asked me to create this division because most people are not aware that there was huge national resistance by museum professionals, African-American museum professionals, to the creation of the museum. And the enabling legislation requires the museum to serve the African-American museum field. And the funding that went to the Institute of Museum and Library Services was the other piece of that. So the museum had to do this work, and IMLS had a federal fund to support that work. And I came in 2012 to start the department, strategic partnerships. And what Lonnie was asking was that not only did I bring maybe certain skill sets, but that I brought my relationships, my museum relationships to the organization, because Smithsonian didn't have any with African-American museums. I mean, one or two maybe, but that was really it. And so the first couple of years when I was really by myself, and then as I grew a team, we did a lot of listening. We did a lot of asking people what they needed, how they needed. We sat in on many different types of meetings. I had been recruited by Jim. I was recruited to join the AAAM board in 2010. And shortly after I got there, and I would say to Lonnie, you should be supporting AAAM because this is going to be this is the umbrella for all of this that could be a very strong unifier. And I remember the day that I first came in, he said, well, there you go, that's your job. So I was already on the board of AAAM, but there were things that we needed for AAAM to illustrate, to go after the kind of stability and growth it needed. So I led the writing, although the OSP team worked with me on the writing of the grant to IMLS. That was for strategic planning and assessment of the field. And that would underwrite the recruiting of an executive director and pay salary for 3 years. That happened in 2012, 11, I can't even remember. But that is one reason that the Office of Strategic Partnerships has been so heavily involved in AAAM to really leverage and amplify those resources. And it has worked very well. We've been in a position now of gradually stepping back as AAAM, the board and the organization grow and do on their own terms all these fabulous things. We also began to look at, aside from a national, a regional approach. I joined the board of SCMC because some 60-something% of our institutions are in that geographic zone. And I was realizing that, one museum didn't know about the museum across the street. We were looking at also cost-effective and more accessible additional kinds of resources and collaborations, because one of the issues with fundraising now is if you cannot illustrate partnership, local, regional, national, in what you do, you are not a strong contender for support and funding. Also, very often, half of these resources that they were looking for, or half the skill sets that were needed, were literally within arm's length. And by museums beginning to work with each other and sharing resources and collaborating, they were amplifying visibility exponentially. And SEMC is a very strong, probably the strongest of all the regional models. If you look at the regional organizations, I will next month complete my term of service on that board, but we have revamped the Jekyll Island Management Institute to reflect current concerns. It was a restructuring or revisiting in a model that had not changed in 20 years. And I attended Jimmy back in 2010, self-paying just to experience what people were being taught, what emerging and to mid-career museum professionals were, what their situation was, what they were looking at. So a lot of what OSP did was actually based on evidence and documentation. We did a survey in 2013 of HBCUs, HBCU museums and archives. That national survey informed our steps in piloting some internships, piloting other kinds of things, convening small groups throughout these several years, and the launch of the HCAC initiative, which is the pilot version of this consortium that we hope will continue to grow. I've decided go big or go home. So I'm very active right now in not the actual implementation, although I led the writing of the grant, the National Endowment for the Humanities and IMLS grants. We are going after additional monies, and I want to go for an endowment that will continue to have it expand and continue and expand in perpetuity. So my role has changed also at the African American Museum, and that I've got an incredibly competent, strong, insightful, experienced team. Most of them did not come from a conventional museum background. They had, I felt that we needed to have a diverse backgrounds and experiences that would inform contemporary practice. I didn't know, there was no such thing as museum studies when I was doing this work in the 90s. I remember the first time Bank Street asked me to come and lecture. I said, well, huh? What would that be? Like, so what do you do? Like, I mean, we all learned by apprenticeship, but it was also a very flexible way of learning. And I had to learn mount making and 3D design and 2D design and audience research, grant writing, et cetera. We actually had to learn it by doing it, but we also learned in collaborative and cohort kinds of ways. And I think that having that kind of training as a museum professional has heavily influenced my perspective on why we do what we do and how we should do it. I feel that in this age of celebrating the curator, whatever that means, somehow people think that being a curator is being an art curator, and that's sort of a celebrity status that's about being individually creative. I mean, I get that, but I've curated multiple exhibitions. I've also co-developed with others multiple exhibitions, and some of them are, to have an exhibition that becomes the core backdrop for the Field Museum, 30 years later is sort of like, people, well, I do want them to change it, but it's, when you see the impact on the ground, that is because we're engaged at that level on the ground, understanding how people learn, listening to people, listening to audiences, and they tell you what their priorities are, the ways in which they need to get information or need to experience something, it's heavily influenced how I do my work and how our entire division does its work. We're the only unit of this sort that exists at Smithsonian because Lonnie asked me to invent it. It is now being replicated in several other Smithsonian units, and even some of the work that we do, for instance, with internships, where we had to push against standard Smithsonian practice. We had to say no, we had to refuse, we had to insist. That practice has now become the standard for all Smithsonian effective this year. So we are accustomed to being accountable and transparent and collaborative in our practice. So that's sort of a multi-tiered way of how I got to the museum. And right now, actually, as of last month, I'm leading our Shared Future Race Initiative, which is a pan-Smithsonian initiative that was launched in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the pandemic of COVID. Just so many things it's in response to the public demand, the public insistence throughout the nation, in all places at all levels, and for our purposes across Smithsonian, of how we have to do our part We cannot fix racism, but there are things that we can do and that we can model at our insistence. When this Bank of America gives $25 million, and I was among the people that said, why? What has Smithsonian ever done? I mean, there's some great people and some great projects, but that's not Smithsonian practice. It's not, no, it is now. And this initiative is one way in which, because I do think Smithsonian has the capacity, we have convening power, we are multidisciplinary, and unlike most museums that are dependent in different ways for their operations, the American people pay for 60-70% of what we do. I feel we are obliged to do this, but to do it in collaboration with others. This project launched a year ago, and I wasn't paying attention because I wasn't paying attention because I was the interim director for the National Museum of African Art, and that required some huge restructuring, and that was my focus. And there's a new phenomenal director in place as of July. I'm very happy for that. And we will be working collaboratively with the National Museum of African Art, which is asking many of these questions in international context, but the global is also local now in the 21st century. So there's a radical sea change. But I really was not paying close attention, and it was going in a different direction. And the secretary asked me to take it over and redirect it. And that's what I'm in the middle of doing right now. It will be highly collaborative. I feel that if we have what funding we have and what funding that will come in should be predominantly expended in institutions around the country to support their doing this work. We are learning from partner institutions, but we have a leadership capacity, not expertise, but capacity. So we will be learning as we go, and we can be a great, we can in our own work and in our own practice internally model what we feel others can do. We can illustrate that for the nation. I've come to discover that, whereas I was very skeptical, the Smithsonian is perceived in many arenas, in most arenas, as the king of the hill, the gold standard, the reigning, whatever it is. We've discovered among especially many educators in all levels, informal and formal, and for many organizations that are trying to do this equity and social justice work, and they get pushback or they're not getting board support, because we are doing it, it gives them credibility and legitimacy for them doing it. For that reason alone, I think it's important. So we shall see. Ask me a year from now. Ask me 6 months from now. But that's what I'm probably spending 75% of my time on this, restructuring this initiative and pushing it out in different ways, and having things come in. We are going to be getting advice not only across Smithsonian, but from colleagues and peer institutions such as yours across the country. That process will begin this fall and probably go through the spring as a first step. So that is, all right. Now, which questions would you like me to focus back in on? This is a trail in my mind, but it may not be coming out that way.
No, this is wonderful, but you've prompted about 1 million different questions on my end, which unfortunately we're not going to have time to cover all of them today. But I do want for you to reflect on the changes you've seen at the Smithsonian, because you started talking about coming on at a time when the Smithsonian was particularly conservative. But today you mentioned the secretary has invited you to work on this. That secretary, of course, being Lonnie Bunch. And I'm wondering if you might reflect on how the Smithsonian has evolved since you were first approached to participate in this project to where it is today with Lonnie Bunch leading the whole thing.
There have been, like any organization, Smithsonian leadership has its ups and downs. It's more effective, and in my view, sometimes less effective leadership, and that's publicly acknowledged. But putting issues of, and I'll just call it broadly, social justice, first and foremost, as a driver for everything that we do, what really prioritizing it in terms of what we will do and won't do, prioritizing it in terms of how we do what we do, and why we will not do what we do is this is the first time it's been this broadly and consistently made front row center. It is also the centerpiece. It's of a massive pan-Smithsonian fundraising effort. It's going to affect it. This is not African American and the Women's Museum and the Latino Center and the Anacostia Community Museum, or the Asian Pacific. It's science, technology, you name it. It's every unit. And it's internal. As we restructure a lot of the criteria that have been the assumptions for hiring, promotion, even at that level. The idea, I have challenged what they would call credentialing. Is it an academic with a PhD and X number of books or articles behind her or his name who is the best curator? Or can other kinds of criteria be evaluated as well if we are looking at this lens? Because the old Smithsonian model was a very old elitist academic model, really more out of the Ivies than anything else. But it also meant that although we are a publicly funded research and education institution, the largest in the world, and heavily supported by the American people, that there was no accountability about public service, which I think that the public value proposition for this kind of a museum has to be part of everyone's position description, requirements for evaluation, et cetera. It also should impact who we hire and how folks are promoted and how. That has already begun. And the hiring of a diversity officer for Smithsonian to look at all of these practices, including credentialing across the board. All of this is under discussion, under review, and under challenge. The sort of exemptions that, elite corners that are perceived as the leading ones, or elite divisions that are not held accountable in the same way that the public facing ones are, is being eliminated. We are all accountable in more defined ways. And I think that although there were other secretaries, and the National Museum of the American Indian was created, of course, in opposition to the standard. Its internal practice is different. African American was created in opposition. And maybe because Lonnie came on as the founding director, and those discussions and issues were from the very beginning at the table and insisted on by external advisors, internally, by the team and individuals he hired, we had a very conscious, a very intentional path of development. Being a new museum, it was in many ways easier for us to walk an intentional path that was aligned with cultural and historical values than it might be for, say, the Museum of Natural History, that's the oldest one and been around forever, and it's huge, and it has staff who have been on since the 60s and 70s. It's more difficult to turn around the Titanic than it is to start out. Now, having said that, that's, Smithsonian is huge. It's the Titanic as well. But there is an accountability, in part because of the changing requirements in leadership. I mean, first, when 20 years ago, how many women were Smithsonian directors? You could count on one hand and have fingers left over. I would say right now, 60% of directors are women. That's true in finance. That's true in administration. That's true in legal. That's true. I mean, it's the number of women has been an indicator, and people who have come on who have broader experience beyond the purely academic in leadership. It is better understood that organizational leadership is different than academic or research leadership. And there are individuals who bring both, but that was not even even the search for the director of African art, I was on that search committee because I recused myself immediately. I wanted to be on that search committee. And half of the committee members were talking about someone's publication, someone's recent exhibit, their training at the Yale, blah, blah, blah. And I said, that's all well and good, but you're talking about curatorial qualifications and background that can inform leadership. But we're talking about a particular unit that needs a total transformation. And so we need someone who brings organizational thinking skills and experience. It took a while, but they finally sort of got that. I said, remember, this person will hire curators, okay? Thank you. So that's that kind of thinking, understanding 21st century leadership skills, understanding 21st century accountability, transparency, documentation, as opposed to the sort of, celebrity mentality culture, is a huge thing. It's because it's Smithsonian, these things are now broadly vetted. The secretary himself may really love a certain candidate, but he's got to go through all kinds of things and face 2 or 3 other peers who can weigh in equally. Although he makes the ultimate decision for certain levels of hires, he must document and defend that. That is a very different proposal now when this is very public, on record, and shared. And this secretary has strengthened all of those protocols. So it's the increasing that we now have for the first time an undersecretary for education, where education was sort of seen as a handmaiden activity, as opposed to sort of the bedrock of why we do what we do. We have an undersecretary for education who is phenomenal. She's still new, phenomenal already, but elevating public access and public education and on equal footing with all of these other things has been a long time coming, and there were goodwill gestures towards it, but it's in place. I believe that this secretary was ready to do this because of his experience at the African American Museum in ways that were very public, that were deeply discussed all the time, and that were very vetted and had to be transparent. There was a lot of, the original pushback from the African American museum field was also matched by skeptical audiences who were like, Smithsonian, they're not going to do this. The very fact that they spent the first 3 years going around the country and asking people, what do you need and how do you need it? What is important to you? How do you see this? And at the same time, elevating the recognition of the audiences, among the audiences that we serve, many of the top stakeholder audiences, like regular people who were not celebrities, were not of the talented 10th, were not millionaires. The museum spent a lot of time asking regular, normal people, wherever they were, including small towns, small communities, et cetera, what is important to you? It also really illustrated for people that what they had in their own homes, in their own heritage, in their own worldviews in terms of cultural practice was very valuable. And that has all been elevated and in a sense, made public in ways that they never expected to see. For me, that revelation happened the year I joined Field Museum in 1990. I had to go to Washington because I was working on this NEH proposal. And back then, if you were going to submit a draft, you had to submit it by a certain date, and then you had to go there physically with a hard copy and take notes. And Michael Spock said at the time, while you're there, there's an exhibit called From Field to Factory, American History you might want to see. And I was like, okay, And I remember I had never seen an exhibition that, other than art, an individual artist, focused on African American history. Community stories. And I remember walking into American history, going into that exhibit, and literally it knocked me off my feet. I was so stunned at what I was seeing. I had to ask the security guard, was it a violation if I sat on the floor? Because I could not stand. It was in many ways because my mother's people come from a, village, small town in Mississippi. It was the story I had heard from childhood through all of our family, writ large in a public space. It had never occurred to me that you could do that. That changed everything for me. And I probably still have the little, there wasn't even a poster. There was this little thing that I laminated that, and when the first time I met Spencer Crew, I was like, yeah, jaw dropped, agog. I was asked a couple of years later to actually be what did they call it? Bernice Reagan Johnson had an annual African American program that was an extraordinary program. I went to it every year, and the year that it was on African diaspora, I was asked to be the chair. But that was the first time I met Spencer Crew, and when I was on stage, I had to acknowledge how that it just completely turned me around. It's hard for many of our younger colleagues, such as yourself, maybe, to represent what a sea change that was. It just didn't exist before. And now it was an exemplar for what we could do with the stories we could tell, like, regular, normal people from Lexington, Mississippi, perhaps.
And of course,
Okay.
Spencer Crew went on to bridge the leadership from Lonnie Bunch to your new director at the National Museum as interim director. And I would just note that from field to factory, at least a portion or from the traveling exhibit that went around the country still is part of the permanent exhibition at the Smith Robertson Museum and Cultural Center in Jackson today. So, so much that I want to talk about, but no, it's really wonderful. I do want to come back. Of course, you've talked at length about the Black Museum field and resistance to the Smithsonian, but the intentionality of the onboarding of visiting communities around the country to get buy-in and to ask what they wanted, and your own recruitment to join the AAAM board, the Association of African American Museums. Before we run out of time, I was hoping you might talk more about your history with AAAM specifically in the Black Museum field, and how it has evolved over time.
When I came on the AAAM board, there had been several years of how could I put it? There were people who were totally dedicated, et cetera, but it was very uneven organizationally. We didn't have the resources that the organization had not grown very much. There were the passionate members, and there were people who were interested, but it didn't have the money, the leverage to really have a firmer footing and platform. It didn't have the reach yet that it needed to bring people on board. It didn't have the data to be able to say, this is what we've done, this is where we're going, here's our strategic move, and basically all of this kind of funding comes from foundations and et cetera, and they require this information. So the people who were in my core cohort, Nona Martin and others, we began really looking at this, and Sam Black was president at the time. I became vice president. And in part, it was to really gather, what were we looking for? We put out calls to the membership, what were the priorities? And that was what informed, I pledged as part of my board service to write a proposal to IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, for that strategic planning, basically, phase. In the middle, and I remember early on in that, it was just, it was because I think none of us came from museums that gave major financial support. We were, it's interesting when I think about it, because there were people who were on that board who had served, and they were highly skilled, highly knowledgeable. We didn't have yet a strong structure to put all of that in place and then move it consistently forward. That process began around that time. Actually, the wake-up call was when I came on board, I didn't receive the 990s that showed, finances and all of that. And I said, in my package, I'm missing this. And they said, yeah, you'll get it. And after 3 months, I was like, I haven't gotten it yet. And they said, yep, you'll get it. And after 6 months, there's going to be a board meeting. And I said, if I don't receive this, I'm going to have to step down because, guys, we're held accountable for this. And just before that meeting, the the 501, the nonprofit status was withdrawn. And I was like, what? And it turned out that the IRS reporting hadn't happened in a couple of years because there was don't ask me why, there was a blind accountant. I'm not sure what fell through the cracks. And we also understood at that point that the person who was managing this had become ill and was really trying to stay afloat, but had not shared that status broadly. And there was just accounting and reporting that hadn't happened. And thanks to Nona Martin took the lead as treasurer in doing all of that forensic accounting, the paperwork as a team. We pulled together, got all the documentation in place, et cetera. And fortunately, after 7 months, I think, of having that submitted, that status was restored, and in fact, retroactively. But that was the wake-up call that we had to learn to do business in a much more substantial way. And going forward, that in terms of board members who came on, they took on that. We strengthened the board, in a sense, onboarding process. We really insisted on that. I realized there were board members who didn't realize what they were accountable for. There were some templates out there already. So we began putting more of that in place. With the IMLS funding that came in, that was the assessment of the field. We were able to talk about the status of the membership, what the priorities were for the membership. With the strategic planning, we were able to really put a coherent, intentional strategy that was prioritized together. And be able to also hire someone. We knew it takes an incoming director a couple of years to be able to basically get in place, get the ropes on, and then earn their salary, among other things. So putting that in place, going through that process, I believe that AAAM has strengthened just exponentially. One of the roles that I felt that the Office of Strategic Partnerships could play, because we're in Smithsonian, because we're in this museum, because we have this platform, was raise the visibility. And by sponsoring, by underwriting scholarships, by inviting program officers from foundations, convening small groups to really talk about strategic issues, it really raised the visibility of the organization as it was expanding in this new format. When we realized that when the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, and IMLS send staff to observe this meeting, while there are these national convenings and much larger groups, AAAM began to be perceived as the go-to, as the benchmark for many of the other long-standing organizations. And I mean, it's clear even today, if you look at program elements and ideas and protocols that AAAM has put in place over the last 5 years, very long-standing organizations have mimicked it and do even now. Even now, other organizations are looking at the AAAM program and they're replicating it, and which is great. But the sort of the footprint, the street cred, the credibility, the faith in AAAM investment has risen exponentially. I like to think that I was part of a board that did that my team was part of strengthening that in that way. But we're definitely not the only ones. But we had a platform. Let's put it out there. And AAAM now is I look forward to hearing what the current board's priorities will be. See, where can we weigh in terms of support? Where can we spread that message, et cetera? The organization is in a completely different place. And it's also a completely different generation of leadership. One of the things that I have been concerned about is leadership training, because just working in your own organization is not the same as leadership. Being the head of your organization is often not enough, generally not enough, in terms of leadership in the field, because our footprint as an organization is bigger than the sum of our parts, our individual pieces. So AAAM is now the go-to in many arenas for other international museum organizations. So that, for instance, MAC, the Museums Association of the Caribbean, has been strengthened immeasurably, not only by its own excellent work, but by the fact that AAAM has members who say, wait a minute, we belong to both of these, the Caribbean and AAAM. And there are MAC members in the Caribbean and South America who are members of AAAM because they're learning so much from the professional practice. You know, when you have Canadian museums attending AAAM, you know you've begun to arrive. Right now, I'm in the middle of developing a training in conjunction at the request of ICOM, the International Council of Museums, which is, it'll actually be announced probably in January, a training for African-American institutions that want to strengthen their capacity to do international work. ICOM is going to pay for half of this. And then they came back and said, could we add 10 African museum professionals? Because they're getting African museums that are looking at AAAM models and footprints, and they would like to be more directly involved. So this is going to be a training that'll be offered in 2022 for 15 AAAM, well, not just AAAM member institutions, but African-American museum institutional, institutions, and 10 African museum institutions. They'll, review team, vetting, et cetera, and with complimentary 2-year memberships to ICOM US as well. So, I mean, this is being finalized only now, but we're getting, because of the work of AAAM, because of its visibility, because its leadership is increasingly, it has a range of generations in leadership, but AAAM acknowledges younger leadership than many of the older established, more conventional institutions or membership organizations do, especially like with ICOM or something. I mean, everybody's my age over there. It's like, a bunch of geezers and geezerettes, shall we say. But no, and basically because it's leadership in practice, you learn leadership in the practice of leadership. So we want to have this span and this experience. That has not been conventional museum practice, besides the performative wokeness and testimony to the contrary. It's not there yet. But AAAM is a really culturally defined model of that. There are things that, AAAM does what most museum organizations do, but the way in which we do it in deference to our own history and cultural values is different. The style of delivery is different. And so AAAM as an organization has been a model for many others that say, wait a minute, I can bring my full self to the table. I don't have to be my Black South Side of Chicago person in one venue and be a different kind of person in another. That was something I intentionally decided to bring to the Smithsonian, to the development of OSP. My team knows that, I decided to let them understand that they could bring their authentic selves, shall we say, to the work they do. We don't all have to be clones of some sort of model of I don't know what. And the only way of doing that was by my doing it, and they could see there wouldn't be pushback or like scolding. So that's been, I'm a parent. You bring your parenting skills to the table in leadership as well.
Well, your influence on the field has been deeply felt. I can tell you everyone I talk to mentions your name in terms of their own professional development and place in the field, and their deep gratitude for your role here. You've mentioned those kinds of people for you, particularly Spencer Crew and the From Field to Factory.
Amina Dickerson. Oh my goodness. Now, of course, this is an age thing. Names are going out of my head. There are any number of African-American and non-African-American models, exemplars. Joanne Rizzi, who's probably younger than I am, who's now at Science Museum of Minnesota. I mean, there are people that you work with who are involved in duking it out with you. I mean, when you have to go up against protocol and you have to go up against practice and you say, and I'm not going to do so-and-so, or I decline such and such. There are any number of people, some of them in the museum field, others outside the museum field, that have influenced me. And I can send you a list of those names because probably off the top of my head, I'm losing them. It's one of those, some of us who are in our golden years forget at the spur of the moment.
So what is your vision for the future of AAAM and the Black Museum field?
Strengthening our individual and collective abilities. That strengthening and that capacity building, that professional development means being able to engage more people, more professionals in the field and let's say it, at living wages, at competitive wages. We are beginning to see that happen. That was an old draw where some of your best and brightest, whatever, would be pulled to, the Met, the this, the that. When you can be competitive in your own community as well, whatever kind of platform you want to be on, that really signals a change. It signals a change, especially to outside observers, when they see that you may choose to remain at a smaller museum, or you may choose to remain in a specifically focused museum rather than being drawn to the Met, the whatever, that have been historically these hallmarks, where people are often treated also very poorly, and that have these siloed cultures that are very hostile, that are also often degrading. It's not for no reason that many, especially younger professionals, have opted out of the field, have opted out of this kind of, not this kind of work, but have opted out of institutional work. They're tired of it, despite the hype to the contrary, which happens especially in the museum field. Museums that are saying, we're so woke, and then then all the employees like riot or form a union. I'm sorry, I've been involved in a lot of these discussions recently. It's like, I know that when I see it. There are museums, I see the African-American museum field and African-American professionals in the African-American museum field being pulled into other kinds of museums because of those skill sets and perspectives and assets that they bring to any kind of museum. It could be rocks and stars. Why not? So I'm very interested. I am hopeful that we will also see African-American museum professionals diversify the topics and ranges. Obviously, history, culture, community, performance, art is so central, but I believe that we also should be informing the hard sciences. One of training that we're developing right now at the request is about urban environmentalism. What does that, what does, and this is actually, it's a train the trainer kind of thing. It's so that our museum staffs, wherever they are, can look around their immediate communities and talk about food justice, environmental pollution, whatever it may be. Food deserts. I mean, to really have a coherent thing and to be able to teach at all levels and partner at all levels around the environmental issues, whether it's climate change to food justice, whatever that may be, where they are. That's not outside our historic scope or practice. That's something we've always done, but we've always tended to do it in ways that were part of our daily lives and practice. That's also professional work that we are very seriously engaged in as community members and as practitioners. And we can, so there are a number of fields that we are at OSP experimenting in, where we're hearing people with more skill sets, ethical interpretation. If you are a frontline staffer and you're 24 years old and you're talking about the history of a plantation or a historic house that was a slave cabin, and someone who is your grandfather's age and also African-American says, baby, it didn't happen like that. Let me tell you, because my father was of that generation. That's a really hard thing for them to push back against. We developed this interpretation training because of the burnout and the high turnover and people feeling they were not emotionally prepared to deal with that, either from boards or recalcitrant visitors, or sometimes their own family members, or they're just feeling quite somewhat inadequate in terms of having the vocabulary, having the context. In this case, we went after, supporting the youngest and often the least paid of our staffs, who are also doing this really important frontline work, because there wasn't anything else at the time. It's now morphed and it's growing, et cetera. But what we do at OSP is in response to what we see the request from the field on the ground, not from some theoretical abstract need. So we'd like to think that we are responsive while we are also, we've sort of been like, sailing the boat while we build it, but we are trying to stay in alignment with what AAAM and other comparable organizations are saying they need. In 21st century terms, that's what our service should be like.
Last question. Recommendations for people who want to enter this field, and any closing comments?
I would like people to consider entering the field from wherever they are of their own interest, whether they're in chemistry, political science, biology. I feel that we need broader skill sets, more diverse skill sets to come into this field. There are all kinds of entry points, and there tend to be the sort of 1, 2, 3 roles that people are familiar with, but we need people who bring strong business backgrounds, strong finance backgrounds, organizational management backgrounds, as well as content backgrounds or particular. And actually, if one has, and I would say public humanities backgrounds, understanding what it is to translate your skill set into organizational behavior, whatever that is, and into the public humanities, which is audience serving, outward facing, as opposed to this is what I like to do. I mean, you can marry those things, obviously, but that would be it. Last words, we stand to serve. Let us know what you need. We're pushing, I'm pushing for an endowment and for endowments, as a matter of fact, because once you get into this work and you're able to execute it and you're able to organize around it, you realize there's the long view, and then there's the very long view. And we should not be so as vulnerable to a great administration versus a hostile administration, good years versus bad years. We need, as institutions in this field, to really beef up our financial resources so that we have far more control over our future direction and planning, execution, retaining staff. And that's a long view version. I'm very much interested in folks who are in advancement and development, because they're incredibly, this is the environment we're in. And so we've got to be able to compete and to participate and to collaborate on multiple levels. It's a lot easier to go in your own direction when you've got that multi-million-dollar endowment.
I am deeply grateful for that work, especially, and the work of the History and Culture Access Consortium, the HCAC, which you mentioned, which of course we're a part of at Jackson State and the Margaret Walker Center. So much more we could talk about, but Dr. Mack, thank you so much for being a part of this project. I'm very grateful for you.
And I apologize to Al if his fingers are cramping at this point. Yeah.